26 March 1986 began, like any other ordinary day, in Tacoma, Washington. Children played in the parks. Families enjoyed the calm of an early spring afternoon. No one could have imagined that within a matter of hours, a terrible crime would leave the community shaken for decades to come. Michella Welch was only 12 years old. She had blonde hair, a cheerful personality, and her whole future ahead of her. That day, Michella was at a local park looking after several younger children. It was a routine activity, an ordinary afternoon so unremarkable that no one could have imagined it would be the last time she would be seen alive. Then, without warning, Michella disappeared. At first, people assumed she had simply wandered somewhere within the large park. But as the minutes passed, confusion quickly turned to concern. Concern became fear, and when search teams began combing the nearby wooded area, a devastating reality emerged. The entire city of Tacoma was stunned. An innocent child had become the victim of one of the most haunting crimes in local history. Detectives launched an intensive search for the person responsible. Hundreds of leads were examined, numerous suspects were considered, thousands of investigative hours were devoted to the case. Yet, year after year, the most important question remained unanswered. Who killed Michella Welch? 32 years passed. The children of that era grew into adults. Detectives retired. Michella's family grew older while carrying a grief that never truly faded. Like so many cold cases across the United States, the investigation appeared to be slipping further into the past. Then, a scientific breakthrough that seemed more at home in a crime drama than real life opened a door that many believed no longer existed. From the tiny traces left behind on that spring day in 1986, a secret hidden for more than 3 decades began to emerge. What shocked many people most was not only the identity of the man responsible, but the fact that he had lived among the community for all those years without attracting suspicion. If you enjoy cold cases solved through DNA evidence and would like to follow more compelling true crime investigations, be sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you do not miss future cases. Tacoma, Washington, in the mid-1980s, was a relatively peaceful port city situated along the shores of Puget Sound. Residential neighborhoods stretched beneath rows of green trees. Children still rode their bikes freely around the neighborhood after school, and parents rarely worried about their kids playing outdoors. It was a time when many families believed their communities were safe enough for children to enjoy their childhood in the most natural way possible. Amid that quiet rhythm of life, the Welch family was living what seemed like an ordinary life. They were not wealthy, well-known, or in any way different from the thousands of other families living in Tacoma. Like many others, they were simply trying to build a stable life and raise their children in a safe and loving environment. In that home lived a young girl named Michella Welch. At just 12 years old, Michella was at an age when every day seemed to bring something new and exciting. She enjoyed spending time with friends, loved outdoor activities, and was always looking forward to the small adventures that came with school life. Those who knew Michella often remembered her as a friendly, caring, and approachable girl. She found it easy to get along with others and brought a sense of happiness to those around her. To her parents, Michella was a source of immense pride. She was regarded as a responsible and trustworthy child, more mature than many of her peers. Her family trusted her with everyday responsibilities and felt comfortable leaving her in the company of younger children. That trust had been earned through her dependable nature and the care she consistently showed towards those she loved. Former classmates later recalled that Michella was not someone who sought to be the center of attention. Instead, she was well-liked because of her sincerity and open personality. Her smile remained a lasting memory for many who had known her. It was the image of a young girl enjoying the best years of childhood, with a future that still appeared wide open and filled with countless possibilities. No one in the Welch family had any reason to believe their lives were about to change. No one could have imagined that the ordinary moments they shared each day would later become treasured memories. At that time, Michella Welch was simply a 12-year-old girl with her entire life ahead of her, a child growing up surrounded by the love of her family and the sense of security that Tacoma seemed to provide. At that time, Michella Welch was simply a child, with her whole future stretching out before her, a future that everyone believed she would have the opportunity to live to the fullest. The spring of 1986 was gradually bringing fresh color to Tacoma. The cold winds of winter had faded, giving way to pleasant afternoons when local parks and recreation areas once again filled with laughter and conversation. For local residents, it was the perfect time to get outdoors and enjoy the fresh air after months spent largely indoors. Life moved at a steady, familiar pace and seemed little different from the years before. Amid that ordinary routine, Michela spent an afternoon much like countless others from her childhood. She was with her two younger sisters, watching over them as they played and enjoying time outdoors. Those who knew her remembered Michela as caring, responsible beyond her years, and often entrusted with looking after younger children. It was a role she had fulfilled many times before, so no one had any reason for concern. As daylight began to fade, groups of people gradually started preparing to head home. Some packed up their belongings, while others gathered their children before leaving. The surroundings remained as peaceful as ever. Then a small detail emerged, so minor at first that almost no one noticed. A familiar face was no longer in sight. One person assumed she was with someone else. Another believed she had only wandered a short distance away. Those simple assumptions quickly spread among the people present. The brief period of uncertainty slowly grew longer. Voices began calling her name from different directions. Pathways, grassy areas, and playgrounds were searched repeatedly. The more people looked, the more tense the atmosphere became. The most frightening part was not what anyone found, but the fact that they could find no sign of Michela at all. A growing sense of dread settled over those involved in the search. The confidence they had felt at the beginning disappeared, replaced by an increasingly troubling fear. By then, everyone understood that this was no longer a matter of a child becoming distracted and forgetting the time. Something far more serious had happened. As the sun disappeared beyond the horizon and darkness began to settle over the city, the search expanded with increasing urgency. No one realized that the hours ahead would become a nightmare for the Welch family and mark the beginning of one of the most haunting criminal cases in Washington state's history. As the sun disappeared beyond the horizon and darkness began to settle over the city, the search expanded with increasing urgency. No one knew that the hours ahead would become a nightmare for the Welch family and mark the beginning of one of the most haunting criminal cases in Washington state's history. Calls for Michela echoed more frequently through the growing darkness. At first, people still hoped there was a simple explanation. Perhaps she had taken a different path. Perhaps she was with someone she knew. It was also possible that she had simply wandered farther than intended and had not yet returned. But one by one, those possibilities were ruled out as time passed without any indication of where she might be. Concern quickly spread beyond the family members who had been present that day. News of the missing girl began circulating throughout the local community. People who had never met Michela joined the search effort. Public areas, walking trails, and nearby wooded sections were systematically searched. Flashlights pierced the darkness as small groups spread out in different directions, hoping to uncover a clue that might reveal her whereabouts. For Michela's parents, every passing minute became increasingly difficult to endure. The unease they had initially felt was gradually replaced by a fear that was impossible to put into words. No parent wants to consider the worst possible outcome, yet the growing hours without answers allowed those frightening thoughts to emerge. They simply hoped to see their daughter step out of the darkness and reassure them that everything had been a misunderstanding. Meanwhile, law enforcement officers joined the effort. Search teams continued expanding their coverage into more isolated areas. Every clearing, every hidden pathway, and every densely wooded section was examined carefully. By then, the atmosphere no longer resembled that of a routine search. A sense of dread had settled over everyone involved, as though many were beginning to suspect that this situation was far more serious than a child who had simply become lost. Then, while the search was still underway, the outcome everyone feared most became a reality. In a heavily wooded area, searchers discovered signs indicating that Michela had been found. In that moment, the remaining hope almost completely vanished. Expressions of tension gave way to stunned silence. The anxiety that had built over many hours was replaced by shock and overwhelming grief. News spread rapidly throughout Tacoma. A 12-year-old girl would not be coming home. For the Welch family, the life they had known ended that night. For investigators, the scene before them made it clear that they were dealing with an exceptionally serious case, one that law enforcement in Washington state would continue pursuing for decades to come. For the Welch family, life as they had known it came to an end that night. For investigators, however, what lay before them made it clear that they were dealing with an exceptionally serious crime, one that would occupy Washington state law enforcement for decades to come. As soon as the area was secured, forensic specialists and investigators began working through the night. Under temporary floodlights erected in the otherwise silent surroundings, every square meter of the scene was examined with great care. Those present quickly realized this was not a case of accidental death or a random tragic incident. The evidence at the location where Michela was found indicated that she had been the victim of a particularly serious criminal act. Investigators documented numerous pieces of physical evidence left behind in the heavily wooded area where her body was discovered. The ground bore signs that human activity had taken place there beforehand. Even the smallest items of potential evidence were marked, photographed and collected, according to standard procedures. In the mid-1980s, forensic technology was far less advanced than it is today, but those leading the investigation understood that overlooking even a single detail could permanently destroy any chance of identifying the offender. When the post-mortem examination was conducted, the initial findings brought further heartbreaking information. Specialists determined that Michela had been subjected to a sexual assault before her death. In addition, injuries found on her body indicated that the offender had used violence to overpower her. Preliminary conclusions also established that her death was not the result of natural causes or an accident, but the direct consequence of a deliberate act. These findings immediately changed the scale of the investigation. What had begun as a search for a missing child became a major homicide inquiry with the highest level of priority. Specialist units were brought in to assist. The case file expanded rapidly. Numerous theories were explored as investigators worked to determine who had come into contact with Michela during the final hours before she disappeared. Even so, the more information investigators gathered, the more troubling one reality became. The crime scene offered very few clues that could immediately lead to the identity of the offender. No witness came forward claiming to have seen the entire incident unfold. There was no obvious suspect for detectives to focus their attention on. Instead, they were left with a collection of scattered pieces of evidence and immense pressure from a community demanding answers. In the days that followed, thousands of pages of reports would be created, countless interviews would be conducted, and multiple investigative avenues would be pursued. Yet at that moment, standing among the evidence that had just been collected, no one could have imagined that this case would remain unsolved not for weeks, months, or even years, but for decades. Before them was a mystery that had only just begun. And the most important question of all remained unanswered. Who had committed this crime and vanished without leaving a name behind? Before them was a mystery that had only just begun, and the most important question remained unanswered. Who had committed this crime and then disappeared without leaving a name behind? In the days that followed, the Tacoma Police Department operated at near full capacity. Investigators worked around the clock, processing information from the public, reviewing statements from individuals who had been in the area at the time of the incident, and attempting to reconstruct every hour of Michela's final movements. The workload grew rapidly. Every phone call, every account, and every small detail was documented in the hope that it might lead to a viable investigative lead. Outrage spread throughout the community. Many residents struggled to accept that such a cruel act could have occurred in a place long regarded as a familiar destination for local families. Pressure mounted on law enforcement. People expected an arrest to follow quickly, but the reality proved very different. Although numerous leads were collected, none provided the breakthrough needed to move the investigation forward in a meaningful way. The first month saw countless interviews conducted. The list of individuals requiring verification continued to grow. Some people with suspicious histories came under scrutiny. Others were interviewed multiple times. Numerous lines of inquiry were opened and later closed when the evidence failed to support further investigation. One theory after another emerged, only to be ruled out. The greatest challenge was that forensic technology in the 1980s still had significant limitations. Crime scene specialists recovered valuable evidence, but the analytical tools available at the time were unable to unlock its full potential. Evidence that would later become the key to solving the case remained untouched in storage, waiting for a future when science would be advanced enough to reveal the answers it contained. Time continued to pass. Year after year, the case file remained on the desks of successive generations of investigators. Some of the detectives involved during the early stages eventually retired. New investigators inherited the case, reading through thousands of pages of reports and searching for something their predecessors might have overlooked. Yet the outcome remained unchanged. For the Welch family, this period brought a different kind of suffering. The initial loss never faded. It simply transformed into years of unanswered questions. Each year that passed without significant progress made the hope of finding justice seem more fragile. Even so, they refused to accept that the case would be forgotten forever. Meanwhile, The investigation gradually became classified as what law enforcement refers to as a cold case, a serious crime that remains unsolved after years of investigation. Michelle Welch's name slowly became synonymous with one of Washington state's most enduring mysteries. Many Tacoma residents grew up hearing about the case. They knew that somewhere there was a person who understood exactly what had happened in the spring of 1986, yet that individual's identity remained beyond the reach of investigators. As the 1980s came to an end and gave way to the 1990s, and later the 2000s, much of society changed. Technology advanced. Investigative techniques continued to improve. Across the United States, numerous cases once considered hopeless were finally solved. Yet the Michelle Welch case remained unsolved, gathering another layer of time and history with each passing year, a painful reminder that some secrets refused to reveal themselves. What no one realized at the time, however, was that the answer had never truly disappeared. It remained preserved for decades within the evidence collected from that tragic day in 1986, waiting for the moment when modern science would become capable of awakening it from more than 30 years of silence. However, what no one realized at the time was that the real answer had never truly disappeared. It remained there for decades, quietly preserved within the evidence collected on that tragic night in 1986, waiting for modern science to become advanced enough to awaken it from more than 30 years of silence. While the case file sat untouched in the archives of the investigating agencies, life outside continued to move forward. Tacoma changed with each passing year. Neighborhoods expanded. Roads were upgraded. The children who had once attended school alongside Michelle grew up, started families of their own, and moved on to new chapters in their lives. Yet for those who loved her most, time never truly healed the void left behind by the case. Each passing year brought another painful reminder. Birthdays came and went without celebration. Family gatherings were forever missing a familiar place at the table. As her friends graduated, built careers, and became parents themselves, Michelle remained forever 12 years old. That reality made the family's grief especially difficult to bear. They had not only lost a loved one, they had lost every future that should have belonged to her. In interviews conducted years later, members of Michelle's family admitted they had never given up hope. Even as the years passed without any significant progress, they continued to believe that one day the truth would come to light. At times, that belief became fragile, but it never disappeared entirely. Whenever another long unsolved case was finally resolved somewhere else in America, they could not help wondering whether the same might one day happen for Michelle. The local community never forgot either. In the memories of many Tacoma residents, this remained one of the most shocking crimes ever to occur in the area. Those who had taken part in the search that night still remembered the sense of disbelief when the news spread. Some moved away. Others grew old and passed on. Yet the question of the offender's identity remained unanswered. Even within law enforcement, the case left a lasting mark. Many detectives retired before seeing any meaningful breakthrough. A new generation inherited the files, reviewed the old reports, and familiarized themselves with a case that had existed longer than their own careers. Year after year, the volume of records continued to grow, yet the answer everyone sought remained out of reach. By the beginning of the 21st century, the Michelle Welch case had become one of Washington state's most well-known cold cases. To the public, it was the story of a young girl who never had the chance to grow up. To investigators, it was the symbol of a mystery that had resisted every effort to solve it for decades. And to the Welch family, it remained a wound that had never fully healed. Then, just as many people began to believe the case might remain unsolved forever, a quiet revolution was taking place in forensic science. Technologies that had once existed only in research laboratories were beginning to transform the way police investigated serious crimes. No one knew it at the time, but those advances were about to create the greatest opportunity since 1986. And for the first time in more than 30 years, the investigation would move closer to the truth than ever before. Then, just as many people had begun to believe the case might never be solved, a quiet revolution was taking place in the field of forensic science. Technologies that had once existed only within research laboratories were gradually transforming the way police investigated serious crimes. No one realized that these advances were about to create the greatest opportunity since 1986, and that, for the first time in more than 30 years, the investigation would move closer to the truth than ever before. In 2018, the investigators responsible for the Michelle Welch case decided to take a bold step. Rather than continuing to rely on traditional investigative methods that had been tried repeatedly for decades, they turned to a technology that was still relatively new in cold case investigations at the time: genetic genealogy. This was the same approach that had begun attracting national attention across the United States after helping solve several high-profile cases once thought impossible to crack. Everything began with biological samples that had been carefully preserved since 1986. For more than 3 decades, they had remained in law enforcement storage, surviving multiple generations of investigators and numerous advances in technology. Remarkably, despite the passage of time, those samples still contained valuable biological information. What could not be decoded in the 1980s could now be analyzed using far more sophisticated modern techniques. Specialists extracted a DNA profile from the evidence collected at the crime scene and used the data in genealogical research. Rather than searching for a specific individual in traditional criminal databases, they began tracing people who shared distant biological relationships with the person who had left the DNA behind. The process did not provide immediate answers. It was more like assembling an enormous family tree with thousands of branches, and then methodically following each connection to narrow the field of possible candidates. The work continued for months. Analysts examined family records, family relationships, and publicly available information that could be accessed through genealogical research. From a very large pool of possibilities, the list gradually narrowed to a small number of individuals who matched the characteristics investigators were seeking. For the first time in decades, detectives felt they were moving closer to a real person rather than chasing vague theories. The atmosphere within the investigative team began to change. After years with little meaningful progress, each passing week now seemed to deliver another piece of the puzzle. Old files were pulled from storage and compared against the new information. Documents from 1986 were reviewed through an entirely different lens. Details that had once appeared insignificant suddenly became important when considered alongside the latest analytical results. Gradually, all the strands of information began converging on the same individual. One name emerged as the person most likely connected to the DNA recovered from the crime scene. For investigators, this was the moment they had been waiting for over 3 decades. Yet they understood that suspicion alone was not enough. After so many years, even a single mistake could undermine the entire case. What they needed was direct evidence, something undeniable and capable of withstanding scrutiny in court. Rather than publicly revealing their findings, investigators quietly moved to the next stage. A covert surveillance operation was launched. The man who had become the focus of their attention was monitored carefully, and before long, the opportunity they had been waiting for finally arrived. An ordinary item was discarded after use. But that seemingly insignificant object was about to become the key that unlocked a mystery that had remained unsolved for more than 32 years. An ordinary item had been left behind after use. Yet that seemingly worthless object was about to become the key that unlocked a mystery that had remained unsolved for more than 3 decades. For months beforehand, the team assigned to the Michela Welch case had quietly worked their way through family trees, comparing residential records, address histories, and vast amounts of information gathered from numerous sources. The work demanded extraordinary patience. Every new lead had to be verified before investigators could move forward. Once the list had been narrowed to a single standout name, they knew the decisive moment had arrived. Rather than approaching the individual directly, investigators chose a more cautious strategy. His day-to-day activities were monitored discreetly. Their objective was straightforward: obtain a biological sample that could be compared with the evidence preserved from 1986. The opportunity arose at a local cafe. The man under surveillance used a paper napkin and left it behind on a table before departing. The item was quickly recovered in accordance with legal procedures and sent to a laboratory for testing. To an outside observer, it was nothing more than a used piece of paper. To those working the case, it potentially contained the answer that the city of Tacoma had been waiting decades to hear. The following days passed in an atmosphere of intense anticipation. Everyone involved understood the significance of the test. If the results failed to match, the promising investigative path they had spent months building would collapse immediately. If the match was confirmed, it would open a direct path to the offender. When the analysis was completed, the results changed the course of the entire case. The biological material recovered from the napkin matched the evidence preserved from the 1986 crime scene. Forensic experts confirmed that the samples originated from the same source. After remaining silent within archived evidence for more than 30 years, the scientific proof had finally pointed directly to the individual who had been present at the scene of the crime. The name identified in the report was Gary Hartman. Investigators continued to scrutinize the information carefully. Residential records showed that Hartman had been living in Tacoma at the time of the crime, not far from where the tragedy occurred. Information gathered through the modern investigation also aligned with what police already knew about the case. Piece by piece, fragments that had remained disconnected for decades began forming a coherent picture. For those who had devoted years to pursuing the case, it was a moment they would never forget. Generations of law enforcement personnel had searched for answers only to encounter dead ends. Now, science had achieved what traditional investigative methods had been unable to accomplish. The identity behind Tacoma's most infamous unsolved case had finally been established. However, knowing a name was only the beginning. Before the matter could be presented in court, prosecutors needed to assemble a case capable of withstanding every challenge from the defense. Old files were reopened. Reports dating back to 1986 were reviewed once again. Forensic specialists prepared to explain every stage of the DNA analysis process in detail. Every link in the chain of evidence had to be strengthened before the investigation could move forward. Then, in May 2018, more than 32 years after Michelle Welch disappeared, an arrest warrant was officially issued. The man who had lived freely for most of his adult life was finally confronted with a moment he could no longer avoid. The man who had spent most of his adult life living freely was now facing a moment he could no longer avoid. In May 2018, law enforcement officers arrested Gary Hartman. For the public, the news came as a shock. For years, his name had never appeared in media coverage surrounding the Michelle Welch case. He had not been among the well-known suspects previously discussed by journalists. There had been no dramatic manhunt and no high-profile confrontation. Instead, the arrest followed a series of scientific examinations and verification processes carried out quietly behind the scenes. When the announcement was made, the Tacoma community was stunned. A mystery that had existed since 1986 finally had someone being held accountable. For many local residents, it was a moment they had once believed would never come. Decades had passed since Michelle lost her life. Many of the people who had taken part in the search that day had long since moved on to different stages of their lives. Some witnesses were no longer alive to see the breakthrough. Yet, in the end, the truth had found its way to the surface. After being charged, Hartman faced allegations relating to the sexual assault and killing of Michelle Welch. As preparations for trial continued, prosecutors strengthened their case with evidence accumulated throughout the investigation. At the center of the prosecution was the DNA analysis and genealogical research that had identified the individual responsible for leaving biological evidence at the scene. These findings were presented to establish a direct connection between Hartman and the crime committed more than 3 decades earlier. Meanwhile, the Welch family followed each development with a mixture of emotions. For years, they had become accustomed to living without answers. Now, the case was moving towards a real courtroom proceeding. The path to justice was not yet complete, but for the first time in a very long while, they could see the finish line ahead. The months that followed were marked by extensive legal proceedings. Prosecutors prepared to present the scientific evidence supporting the case. Experts were called upon to explain the DNA analysis and the genealogical methods that ultimately led investigators to the suspect. Every element of the case file was carefully reviewed to ensure that each conclusion rested on a solid evidentiary foundation. As the case moved into its most critical stage, the weight of the evidence became increasingly clear. After years of concealing the past, Hartman was no longer facing speculation or suspicion alone. Before him stood a case built upon biological evidence, scientific analysis, and the dedication of multiple generations of investigators. Then the most significant moment finally arrived. During the legal proceedings, Hartman accepted responsibility for the acts committed against Michelle Welch in 1986. For the victim's family, it was not a moment of complete relief. No admission could bring back the daughter they loved. No statement could erase more than 30 years of pain and loss. Nevertheless, seeing the person responsible confront the truth before the justice system marked an important turning point. Now, all attention turned to the courtroom, where the Welch family prepared to come face to face with the man who had stolen Michelle's future. After more than 3 decades of waiting, the sentencing phase was finally approaching, and the words spoken during those proceedings would become some of the most emotional moments in the entire case. Now, all eyes turned towards the courtroom, where the Welch family were preparing to face the man who had stolen Michaela's future. After more than 3 decades of waiting, the moment of sentencing was finally approaching, and the words spoken during that hearing would become some of the most emotional moments of the entire case. As the proceedings entered their final stage, the atmosphere inside the courtroom grew heavier than ever. For many of those present that day, this was far more than a legal process. It marked the end of a journey that had lasted more than 30 years, a journey filled with unanswered questions, hopes repeatedly crushed, and a grief that had never truly faded. Members of Michaela's family took turns addressing the court and describing the impact the crime had had on their lives. Her mother, Barbara Leonard, became emotional as she spoke about the daughter she lost in the spring of 1986. She explained that the pain had remained with her throughout the decades that followed. The milestones Michaela should have experienced never came to pass. There was no graduation ceremony, no wedding day, no opportunity for her to grow into the adult she deserved to become. Time continued to move forward, but the void left within the family was never filled. Other relatives also spoke about the lasting effects of the crime. The greatest loss was not simply a life taken, but the decades spent living with the helplessness of not knowing who was responsible. For so many years, they had woken each morning with the same unanswered question. Now, for the first time in decades, that question finally had an answer. On the other side of the courtroom, Gary Hartman appeared as an elderly man who relied on a walking frame for mobility. The man who had spent most of his adult life living freely was now confronting the consequences of actions committed more than 3 decades earlier. During his statement to the court, he expressed remorse and apologized to the victim's family. For many in attendance, however, those words could not change what had happened in 1986. When the time came for sentencing, the judge emphasized the seriousness of the crime and the lasting harm it had caused to both the Welch family and the Tacoma community. After reviewing the entire case, the court imposed the maximum sentence permitted under the law: 26 years imprisonment. For many people who had followed the case, that number carried significance beyond the sentence itself. At the time of sentencing, Hartman was already in his 70s. It meant that most, if not all, of the remainder of his life would be spent behind bars. While no punishment could bring Michaela back, justice had finally caught up with the man responsible. As the case came to a close, what many people reflected on most was not only the identity of the offender, but also the power of modern science. A piece of evidence preserved from 1986 had survived decades of silence and ultimately revealed the truth. A case once considered nearly impossible to solve had finally been resolved, and a family forced to wait far too long had finally received the answers they had spent much of their lives searching for. Michaela Welch remains forever 12 years old. Her future was taken from her on a spring afternoon in 1986. But her name has not been forgotten. Her story continues to be remembered as a reminder that time may fade many things, but the truth does not always disappear. Sometimes, it is simply waiting for the right moment to be found. Thank you for watching today's story. If you are interested in cold cases solved after many years, criminal mysteries that once left investigators without answers, and cases ultimately resolved through advances in modern technology, please subscribe to the channel so you do not miss future episodes. Each week, we will continue bringing you real true crime cases, untold stories, and journeys towards justice that have spanned decades. Thank you for watching, and we will see you in the next video.